Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and today we're talking about Carl Sagan. I've got Dr. William Lane Craig with me, and this is actually the first time that I've ever heard Dr. Craig discuss some of the arguments against, well, the title of this video is like the strongest arguments against religion from Carl Sagan. That's at least the title of the video that we're reviewing today from Carl Sagan. Someone else, in Sagan's defense, someone else compiled these clips and gave it that title, so I don't think Carl would actually say that these are like the strongest arguments against religion or anything like that, just to be fair as we can. But that's what we're doing today in the show. Is we've got Dr. William Lane Craig back on Capturing Christianity. We're going to be looking at some of these clips. Now, one of the questions that I have for you, Dr. Craig, as we begin this is, how much have you interacted with Sagan's work at all previously? Have you really done much on I mean, he's not really like the central figure in the atheist movement, really.
Well, he was ahead of his time, really. As I watched these clips that you sent me, Cameron, I was just struck at how similar he is to Richard Dawkins. He has the same debonair demeanor, the dashing personality, very articulate. I think he's an excellent spokesman for his point of view. And I remember when Sagan was very popular on television with his Cosmos program. But at that time, I was still too young to be involved in interacting with him. And so I never did have an opportunity to interact with him. And it's only by your resuscitating these videos that I get a chance to do so.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I haven't really paid very close attention to his work, or at least with respect to any sort of overlap with apologetics or religion or anything like that. But there was a video that popped up on my YouTube stream with Carl Sagan, and it had 300,000 views on it, and it was titled, wow, Strongest Arguments from Carl Sagan Against Religion. And I was like, well, I'd be interested to hear sort of what his take was. And one of the things I think you guys will see today as we watch this clip and get Dr. Craig's response to it is he was a lot, I think, different than, at least in his sort of tone and approach to religion. He seems a lot more respectful than some of these other new atheist types that just have this really condescending attitude toward it. I didn't really get that sense from him. There were some like bits and pieces that are obviously, for anyone who follows apologetics or philosophy, it's going to be kind of cringy for listening to someone who is not really a philosopher, not really informed on philosophy, religion, pontificating on these matters. It's always kind of cringy when you come up against that, but he doesn't have, he didn't come across to me, and Dr. Craig, you can share your thoughts on this. He didn't come across to me like he was overly confident or trying to be condescending. He seemed like he was trying to be respectful.
I would agree with that. But in that respect, I think he does resemble Richard Dawkins. I think it's usually the popularizers that are the ones that are so rude and nasty, as opposed to someone like Dawkins or Sagan, who I find quite affable myself.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it. We've got about 11 clips, I think. Let me actually verify that. I can't see the bottom of my, it looks like 9 clips. Okay, we've got 9 clips prepared for you guys today in this video. The whole video is about 10 minutes long, and we've got it split up into different smaller sections that we'll get Dr. Craig's response to. I'm also, what I'm going to do, similar to what we've done in previous videos where we're doing this sort of review of some other video that we find on YouTube, I'll be summarizing the points that he makes. That way it's sort of easier for you guys to sometimes it's not very clear like what argument he's trying to present or what point he's trying to make. So I'll summarize that for you, and then we'll get Dr. Craig's response, and then we'll move back and forth between the clips. So let's go ahead and begin the video. Again, this one is titled Carl Sagan's Sharpest Arguments Against Religion. Let's start the first clip and then get Dr. Craig's response.
What is your personal religion, or is there any type of God to you? Like, is there a purpose, given that we're just sitting on this speck in the middle of this sea of stars? Humans have created a mythological framework that has often involved some kind of higher spiritual powers. And as
every human culture has done,
as that goes away, as we know more and more that, and it seems harder and harder to prove that anything might exist like that, where does that leave us?
On our own, which to my mind is much more responsible than hoping that someone will save us from ourselves so we don't have to make our best efforts to do it ourselves. And if we're wrong, and there is someone who steps in and saves us, okay, that's all right. I'm for that, but we, hedged our bets. It's Pascal's bargain run backwards.
All right, so that's where we'll stop it for the first clip. So kind of the 2 points that he makes here that I caught was we're on our own, which is more responsible than relying on someone else to do it for us. And then he says if there is a God, then we say we hedged our bets. It's Pascal's bargain. He doesn't say Pascal's wager, he says Pascal's bargain run backwards. So let's get your thoughts on this initial clip here.
Well, as hard as it might be to believe, Cameron, it is not becoming harder to prove the existence of God in comparison to earlier centuries. On the contrary, I should say, the evidence from the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, the uncanny applicability of mathematics to physical phenomena, new insights into the ontological argument actually make it easier to prove God's existence today than in previous centuries. And then, of course, the rise of modern historiography and investigation of the New Testament documents makes it vastly easier to prove the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. So I think we're actually very well positioned to provide evidence and argument for God's existence. By contrast, the claim that we are on our own is atheism, and that requires proof. And I don't know of any proof that exists that we are on our own. Now, this reverse Pascal's wager makes no sense at all. The idea here would be that if we deny God's existence and it turns out that God does exist, then we shall be better off than if we believed in him and he exists. And that's obviously not true. On the contrary, we might be a whole lot worse off if we don't believe in God and it turns out that he exists. So this reverse Pascal's wager, I think, is quite hopeless.
Yeah, I didn't even understand what it meant. I was going to ask you, what do you think he even meant by Pascal's bargain run backwards? It just doesn't even make sense to me.
Yeah.
Well, before we get to the next clip, I actually did want to let you guys know, for anyone who is watching live, if you would like to send in a question as a super chat, we will be taking those. This is sort of a change that we're doing on the channels. We're going to be taking those sort of as they come in, and we'll pause sort of what we're doing and take questions as you guys want to send them in. So I have seen a couple things in the live chat, but if you guys want to support the channel and support the work that we're doing here, then just send in a question as a super chat, and we'll take care of it as the stream goes on. So let's move on to clip number 2. This one is he gets asked, "Do I believe in God?" And then he kind of makes a point about which version of God are you talking about. So let's get to this clip here.
I'll say another word. The word God covers an enormous range of different ideas, and you recognize that in the way you phrase the question. Running from an outsized, light-skinned male with a long white beard sitting in a throne in the sky and tallying the fall of every sparrow, for which there is no evidence. To my mind, if anybody has some, I sure would like to see it. To the kind of God that Einstein or Spinoza talked about, which is very close to the sum total of the laws of the universe. Now, it'd be crazy to deny that there are laws in the universe, and if that's what you want to call God, then of course God exists. And there are all sorts of other nuances. There is, for example, the deist God that many of the founding fathers of this country believed in, although it is a secret whose name may not be spoken in some circles, a roi fainéant, a do-nothing king, the God who creates the universe and then retires, and to whom praying to is sort of pointless. He's not here. He went somewhere else. He had other things to do. Now, that's also a God. So when you say, do you believe in God? If I say yes or if I say no, you have learned absolutely nothing.
Okay, yeah. the more I listen to Carl Sagan, and I'll sort of summarize what he just said in just a moment. But as I was listening to like these initial clips when I started to play this video, I was like, what point is he even trying to make here? It's a very long-winded attempt at making a very basic point that, I mean, nowadays, as someone who's entered into apologetics and philosophy as of like a decade ago, there's all sorts of attempts in the literature right now on how to define God, how evaluating God's attributes. You got Richard Swinburne's Coherence of Theism. You got all sorts of attempts at explaining, what God is like. And it was just kind of strange to hear this one. But so to sort of summarize what he just said here, he said, the bearded man in the sky has no evidence. He says, and then you compare that to the Einsteinian, Spinozian concept, which is the sum total of the laws of nature in the universe. And then he says, of course the laws exist. So if God exists, he just is those laws. Then of course God exists. And then he says, well, what about the deist God? Is that a possibility as well? And then his point is that if I say I don't believe in God, then you've learned nothing. So a little bit all over the place, but what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I think what he's saying here is that concepts of God differ. Right. That is typical of the English language. Take, for example, the word chair. There are different concepts of what a chair is. Does it have four legs? Does it have a back? Does it have arms? Is it padded? Is it collapsible? Depends on what kind of chair you're talking about. More importantly, Cameron, think of the word science. There are many different definitions of what science is, but does that mean that the word is therefore useless? Well, obviously not. It just means that we need to clearly define our terms as we use them if we're to avoid misunderstanding.
Yeah, I mean, that actually raises a good point, because there's well-known terms that are discussed in philosophy, like knowledge, that it's like there's all sorts of different definitions that people have offered. People have, torn those definitions apart and everything. But if you say like, hey, I know that 2 + 2 = 4, it'd be kind of silly to be like, well, I've told you nothing if I said that, given the fact that there's all sorts of different definitions of what it means to know something. Yeah. Anything else to say before we move on to clip number 3?
I think that's enough.
Okay. All right. Let's move on. Here's whoops. I didn't put the scene up on the screen for you guys. Here we go. Let's back up a little bit here, and then we'll get this next clip going.
If I say yes or if I say no, you have learned absolutely nothing.
I guess I'm asking you to define yours if you have one.
But why would we use a word so ambiguous that means so many different things?
Gives you freedom to define it.
It gives you freedom to seem to agree with someone else with whom you do not agree. It covers over differences. It makes for social lubrication. But it is not an aid to truth, in my view. And therefore, I think we need much sharper language when we ask these questions.
All right, so quickly summarize this one. So basically he says, why would we use a term that can mean so many things? It would give you freedom to seem to agree with someone else with whom you actually don't agree with. He says it covers over differences, makes for what he calls social lubrication, but it is not an aid to truth. There I'm a little confused on what he means by it is not an aid to truth. But then he says we need much sharper language when we ask these questions. So, Dr.
Yes,
Cole.
one of the great benefits of philosophical analysis is the importance of clear definitions of terms. And this is characteristic of analytic philosophy of religion. So we can second Professor Sagan's concern here for clarity of definitions and consistent use of terms. Absolutely, that is correct.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I suppose, I mean, you're right. There's not a whole lot more to add to this one. It's like, just be careful with your words and define what you mean. And I think that's important. And like you say, like in the analytical philosophy tradition, like that's largely what is attempted to do, is you're trying to give definitions for stuff. And I mean, especially when you enter into a debate, I mean, I've seen many of your debates, and a lot of times you will define your terms very carefully. And even if you don't have time to define it rigorously in a debate setting, you will in your published work. And that's, I think it's a good thing to do. But maybe you can kind of speak to this. I mean, you were not really into, at least at the beginning of the stream, you said that you weren't really doing apologetics or philosophy at the level that you would have been at, to where you would have interacted with him much when you were sort of first starting out. But what was it like back then? Were people just using these terms, not defining their terms? Where's this criticism coming from on his part?
This criticism is attacking popular religion, Cameron. He is not in touch with, or was not in touch with, Christian scholars, but he's attacking popular religious beliefs that you'd find among laymen or in the church. And so his television programs on Cosmos were tremendously popular and influential. You may find it hard to believe as you listen to these arguments that he expresses, but they were very appealing to lay people who were often misled by them, and they just didn't have the resources to reflect critically on what he was saying. And it sounded so commonsensical that surely he must be right. So the man had an enormous cultural influence in the United States.
Yeah, but I think you're right, though. It just, at least from what I've gathered from these clips, it doesn't really seem that he was super informed on Christian scholarship, Christian philosophy. And that's going to be true of a lot of people that are engaging in this arena, that are otherwise experts in other areas. People who might be experts in evolutionary biology or in cosmology, but they're not really experts in religion. And it's unfortunate that people think that being an expert in one area makes you an expert in another area. And I think that's also a symptom of something that's sort of ingrained in culture right now, which is that when it comes to especially like things like morality and religion, everyone is an expert because you sort of experience those things on your own. So you experience you have these sorts of religious experiences on your own. That makes you a sort of expert in that area because you have your own personal experience there. But that's obviously a mistake, because there are experts in pretty much every area of inquiry. People who have really put the time and effort into thinking clearly about these issues, trying to do away with their own confirmation bias and develop arguments and everything. And it's just unfortunate that that's something that I think is really ingrained in culture right now, that when it comes to religion, everyone can have, equal say and everyone's opinion is equally valid, when that's obviously not the case at all. Like you wouldn't approach any sort of scientific matter in that way. You wouldn't be like, well, let me just think about the way that the planets go around in the universe, and then just like come up with my own answer based on my own opinion. No, you would consult the experts and try to figure it out that way. And it's just weird that people don't do the same thing when it comes to religious beliefs. All right, let's move on to clip number 4. And this one, I think after this clip, we start to get into some more interesting material. In this one, he says the essence, he explains the essence of science versus the essence of religion. And so I think the following clips, you guys are going to be, you guys are going to enjoy these. Let's move on.
I think the essence of the scientific method is the willingness to admit you're wrong, the willingness to abandon ideas that don't work, and the essence of religion is not to change anything. That supposed truths are handed down by some revered figure, and then no one is supposed to make any progress beyond that, because all the truth is thought to be in hand. My sense is that the scientific way of thinking, questioning, some delicate mix of creative encouragement of new ideas and the most rigorous and skeptical scrutiny of new and old ideas, I think that is the path to the future, not just for science, but for all human institutions. We have to be willing to challenge because we are in desperate need of change.
Okay, so in this one, just to quickly summarize once again, so he says the essence of science is basically intellectual honesty, and the essence of religion is more or less dogma. And then he says intellectual honesty is the path to human flourishing. What are your thoughts on this clip?
Well, I think that Professor Sagan had a very naive view of religious belief. Even for the person who takes the Bible to be authoritative, the biblical data are often under determinative, and so lots of open questions remain. And therefore, theology can benefit greatly, for example, from philosophical analysis. To give just one of many examples, the Bible teaches that God is eternal, but it does not explain whether that means that God is timeless or whether God is omnitemporal. And it used to be very widely held that God is simply timeless, that he transcends time. But today, a good many theologians would argue that God's eternity is not timelessness, but rather omnitemporality. God exists throughout all of infinite time. So that this is an open question to explore. Similarly, there are many different theories of the Trinity, of the incarnation, of the atonement. And so, as Professor Sagan says, we need to have creative thinking and critical scrutiny of both new and old ideas.
One of the points that I was thinking as I was listening to this clip was that it seems like he's almost making, and I hate to actually throw out names of fallacies just because how often people throw them around and they get them wrong and they don't explain like how it actually even applies. So I kind of cringe internally when I hear people throw around fallacies just sort of willy-nilly, but it does seem like he's making a sort of category error here. So he says the essence of science is intellectual honesty. The reason why I think that that's a category error is because intellectual honesty is not a property of science. It can't even in principle be a property of science because science is the scientific inquiry, and there's all sorts of like you said, Dr. Kerr, there's different ways of defining what science is and everything, but intellectual honesty is a property of persons. Persons
Right.
do science. Persons engage in religious type thinking. And what's I think obvious is that, and this is shown numerous times, there are numerous scientists who have engaged in intellectual sins, right? They've fudged the numbers. They've reported things that just weren't true at all. So intellectual dishonesty can occur regardless because it's a property of persons. It's a sort of it's a sort of natural thing that happens as a result of as Christians from our fallen nature. But the point is that anyone can engage in intellectual dishonesty. Scientists can do it. People of faith can do it. That's not really the difference here. Just any thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right that it's to confuse personal virtues, which need to be inculcated, with the very nature or methodology of a discipline. And what I hope to have made clear in my answer was that theology is committed to the same sort of creative thinking and critical scrutiny of ideas that science is, so that they don't differ in that respect. And then your point as well is a very good one, that these sorts of personal virtues can be exemplified or unfortunately violated by a practitioner of virtually any discipline.
Here's another thing I'd like to get your comments on. So he's sort of putting against science versus religious dogma. And the thought, I think, is that religious dogma is supposed to be this sort of like unquestionable, you can't question it, it's infallible, it's like, at the root, it's just the sort of unquestionable thing. Whereas with scientific beliefs, you can always question them, okay? But what I think want to point out here and get your thoughts on is that I think even in the scientific method or someone who is trying to do science, there are going to be basic assumptions that everyone is going to assume that you might call unquestionable, or sort of these axiomatic foundational beliefs that everyone is going to bring to the table. But that doesn't mean that the scientist can't still be intellectually honest, even if they have these sorts of base assumptions. Here's an example for those of you that are like, well, what sort of unquestionable assumptions could a scientist even like that seems unscientific. Well, here's one. Mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4. That's not really something that you can really question. You can't be like, well, maybe it is the case that 2 + 2 = 5. I mean, I don't know how smart that would be. You can always question anything that you want, but suppose that the person is very confident. The scientist is very confident that 2 + 2 = 4. And that's just something that's part of their foundational beliefs. It doesn't thereby prevent them from being intellectually honest, even if they have this foundational belief that that they think can't really be questioned. And I think the reason why I'm even making this comparison is because the same can be true of the person who is religious, is they've got these foundational beliefs they think can't really be questioned either, but that doesn't mean that they're engaging in intellectual dishonesty. So yeah, any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, it occurs to me that every discipline will have its bedrock set of beliefs that are presupposed by people in that discipline and which are not further required to be justified. For example, say in doing ancient history, such as a study of the Roman Palestine, historians will begin with assumptions like that the Roman Empire actually existed, and no one would be required to justify a bedrock assumption like that. Now, if one were to be challenged, one could explore that and attempt to provide evidence, but some assumptions are so basic, so foundational, that they're simply common property of everyone who's in that particular field of expertise, and then inquiry can proceed after that.
Yeah, and I guess the point that I was attempting to make is that just because you've got a foundational belief, that doesn't mean that you can't be intellectually honest in your search for truth, right? And that can apply to anyone. So let's do this. We did have a super chat that came in. Let's see what this one says and then get some thoughts on it. So this one is from Mihoville. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is especially problematic with scientists. We are presented in media as some kind of mages who can do and know everything. I think this was related to one of the previous points that I was making about scientists being experts in one field, thinking that is going to just transfer over to every other field. Any thoughts on this before we move on to the next clip?
Even though people talk about us living in a postmodern culture, I think that is flatly mistaken as a cultural analysis. I think that our culture remains deeply modernist at its heart, and that it is the deliverances of the sciences that are taken to be authoritative in the quest for truth. And therefore, those who are professional scientists are given a degree of respect and credibility that often spills over into areas beyond their own expertise. I think we saw that so clearly in the recent pandemic, where you remember the watchword on the part of everybody was follow the science, follow the science. Science is the sort of leading light for our culture today, and therefore scientists are often given a degree of authority and credibility that they don't really have, because scientists are typically so highly specialized that they are not expert in areas outside their very narrow area of specialization.
All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next clip. And this one is all about faith. And actually, the thumbnail of the video is featured in this little clip here. So let's go ahead and play this clip and then get Dr. Craig's thoughts.
What is faith? It is belief in the absence of evidence. Now, I don't propose to tell anybody what to believe, but for me, believing when there's no compelling evidence is a mistake. The idea is to withhold belief until there is compelling evidence. And if the universe does not comply with our predispositions, okay, then we have the wrenching obligation to accommodate to the way the universe really is.
All right, we'll play this next clip. He's about to come in, but I wanted to sort of separate these clips apart so we could get Dr. Craig's thoughts on this one. So this one, he basically says something that we've all heard. If you have been engaged in apologetics for any amount of time, you've heard this from atheists. And Carl Sagan, I should also mention this. I should have mentioned it earlier. He did not identify as an atheist. I think he identified something closer to agnostic. So I'm not saying that he's atheist. I'm just saying that we've heard this from atheists. Faith, he says, faith is belief in the absence of evidence. Then he says believing when there's no compelling evidence is a mistake. And then thirdly, he says we should withhold belief until there is compelling evidence. So what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I don't know of anyone, Cameron, who thinks that faith is belief in the absence of evidence. This is a caricature, and I think it shows that Professor Sagan was evidently wholly unacquainted with the discipline of Christian apologetics. At an even more fundamental level, however, contemporary epistemologists have discarded the classical foundationalism that Sagan seems to presuppose. This view that we must withhold belief until we have evidence for something, or that you should never believe anything except on the ground of evidence, would land us in absolute skepticism, and it is in the end self-refuting. So his point here is challengeable on two levels. First, you can give, I think, good evidence for belief in God and Jesus of Nazareth. But then secondly, contemporary epistemology has overthrown and abandoned this classical foundationalist model of knowledge that he seems to be presupposing.
One question that I would love to have been able to ask him is what does he mean by compelling evidence? That can mean a whole lot of things. And so here's maybe one counterexample to that that's really basic and easy to see. I mean, a lot of our beliefs are based on memory, things that we've experienced or done in the past, even reasoning that we've done in the past. For example, like the only way that I know what I ate for breakfast is just literally thinking about it and trying to pull it from memory and be like, okay, well, I had waffles with my wife this morning. Okay. But like, would that constitute compelling evidence in his view? Just being able to like introspect in my mind and find that thing just in there through memory? Like, would that constitute compelling evidence? Because I think I should believe that I ate waffles this morning. So that's one question that I would love to be able to ask him. Any thoughts on that one before I talk about one of the others?
Memory beliefs, testimonial beliefs, like when someone says to you, "Hi, my name is John," and you believe him in the absence of any evidence. Sensory beliefs about the world of physical objects around us, and many other sorts of beliefs are not grounded in evidence. And so you are quite right in saying that this sort of epistemology that he presupposes is refuted by counterexample after counterexample. And that's why this kind of classical foundationalism is widely discarded today.
So there's one last thing I wanted to discuss before we move to the next clip is there's a person who, she's actually on our board at Capturing Christianity, Liz Jackson. She's got some really interesting examples because she talks about faith all the time, and she's got some really interesting thought experiments and examples that she uses when she's discussing the topic of faith. And one of the examples she gives is when you've got faith, or at least a parent that has faith that their child has survived some like hurricane or like earthquake or something like that. Like, you've got to think about all sorts of different scenarios when you're trying to think about what is the proper definition of faith, and then also should you believe in the absence of evidence. And one of the things that she points out is that it doesn't really seem irrational for a parent to believe that their child survived an earthquake, even if they don't have compelling evidence, so to speak, that they survived. That doesn't seem irrational on the parent's part. Maybe you think that it is, but at least it's an entry point into to at least questioning this sort of just basic assertion that you get from Carl Sagan and others that promote this line that we should just withhold belief until there is compelling evidence. It's not always clear in every case that you should withhold belief until you've got compelling evidence. Again, whatever that means. Any thoughts on that example?
I think that that's a great example. You and I on previous podcasts have talked about being pragmatically justified in holding a belief. One of the examples I like is the person who is diagnosed with a fatal cancer, but whose chances of survival will be improved if he believes that he will get better. And so clearly it would be rational for him to believe, contrary to the evidence, that he will get better, because that would increase the chances of his survival, that if he just gives up. So that would be another one of these examples where we could be pragmatically justified in believing something that we don't have evidence for.
And I would also just point out that even if you're not convinced by the things that we're saying, I think what you should at least take away is that these are open questions in epistemology, and you shouldn't just be, I'll use the term dogmatic when it comes to like what you think is true about epistemology. So be open to really evaluating and questioning your own assumptions about what is rational and what is irrational, especially when it comes to what's required in evidence and all that. So, all right, let's move on to the next clip. This one where he talks about the problem of religion. This one is, I think, one of the longest clips. It's about 2 minutes long. Here we go.
I mean, you step forward to say I deny all religion because I can't see it proved scientifically.
No. You see,
and the value of religious experience and the value of reaching for higher experiences.
Let me say, religion deals with history, with poetry, with great literature, with ethics, with morals, including the morality of treating compassionately the least fortunate among us. All of these are things that I endorse wholeheartedly. Where religion gets into trouble is in those cases that it pretends to know something about science. The science in the Bible, for example, was acquired by the Jews from the Babylonians during the Babylonian captivity of 600 BC. That was the best science on the planet then. But we've learned something since then. Roman Catholicism, Reformed Judaism, most of the mainstream Protestant denominations have no difficulty with the idea that humans have evolved from other creatures, that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, with the Big Bang. They don't have any trouble with that. The trouble comes with people who are biblical literalists, who believe that the Bible is dictated by the creator of the universe to an unerring stenographer.
And so therefore they...
And has no metaphor or allegory in
And
it.
from there they make their political and economic choices, and social choices.
And scientific.
And scientific choices. And scientific. And that's part of your problem with that idea.
Exactly.
It is that because for the wrong reasons we make the wrong choices about science.
To get it clear in your head. So religion deals with, he first says religion deals with history, ethics, literature, and then he says all of that is great, and he endorses it. And then he says religion gets into trouble when it pretends to know something about science. Then he makes a really interesting claim about where the science comes from in the Bible. He says the science in the Bible was acquired by the Jews from the Babylonians during the Babylonian captivity, which I'm sure Dr. Craig is going to have some things to say about. Then he says most Christian denominations have no issue with evolution. And then he says the trouble comes with people who are biblical literalists. All right, let's get your thoughts.
Yeah, let's not quibble about the dates of the books of the Old Testament and its relation to Babylon. I don't think that's the heart of the issue. Rather, what Professor Sagan is attacking here is biblical literalism and young earth creationism, which he admits most Christians reject, as do I. So what's the problem? He's attacking a straw man or a caricature.
Yeah, it didn't seem actually like there was a whole lot to necessarily disagree with. Like, yeah, I mean, we don't want to be. I mean, he says biblical literalist, and there you can define literalism in a certain number of ways. Like, I think it was John Walton who said that you may, or maybe it was even you, Dr. Craig, that said something along these lines. Like, if you think the correct interpretation of Genesis is, I'll use John Walton's view, is a functional account, then the literal interpretation of that account would be that it is a functional account. And so you've got to really be careful when you use a term like literal when it comes to interpretation, especially of the Bible. But I did want to kind of like just flag that a little bit. But any other thoughts on that? We did have some super chats that were sent in.
Very, very simple one, that Sagan is here attacking young Earth creationism, and he admits that Roman Catholics, Reformed Jews, most Protestants don't hold to young Earth creationism, as I don't. So there's just nothing here that needs to be refuted.
Yeah. It is also kind of odd that this was included as one of the sharpest arguments against religion from.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Cameron, that's why what I said before, I think really applies, is that this is a popular level critique aimed at the average man in the street who is unread and unstudied and never reflects on these sorts of things. And for that kind of person, boy, I tell you, Sagan's sort of criticisms seem very powerful and profound.
So this one is somewhat related to what we were just discussing from Andre. It looks like is from Brazil. So thank you so much for the super chat. He says, love this kind of interaction. I was with Dr. Craig twice here in Brazil. At which point Sagan's pleasant personality is related to his popularity in being taken seriously about non-scientific issues. So maybe he's just asking, how is that even related? Like seemed like a very nice guy, but why are we taking him seriously when it comes to these sort of non-scientific issues like religion?
Well, I take it that the reason he's to be taken seriously is because he's what we would call a social media influencer. I think you told me, Cameron, that this video you obtained had something like 300,000 views. So we have to take it seriously for no other reason than it misleads a lot of folks.
Yeah, it is very popular, unfortunately. A lot of these sort of basic arguments, even from like Ricky Gervais and Richard Dawkins, obviously is very big. But I mean, that was one of the comments that I got on my Facebook page when I announced that we were going to be talking about Carl Sagan. Is like, why are you attacking this low hanging fruit? Shouldn't you be focusing on these really good popular, or not popular, but really good philosophical arguments against theism, like the problem of evil and stuff? And the response is just that these arguments are very popular. They're being seen by a whole lot of people and influencing a whole lot of people. And it's good. You don't necessarily have to do it all the time, but it is good to address it every once in a while. It's very important and I think valuable to do so, just to kind of build off of what you said here. So, all right, we had one other super chat to go through here. Thank you so much for sending this in. Alina says, a little more of a comment than a question, but I wish people would realize how we use faith for scientific belief too. For example, many things we believe from a textbook we haven't seen ourselves. What are your comments?
Yeah, that is related to believing things on the basis of testimony and authority. When you read a scientific article in a professional journal, it is festooned with footnotes to prior research by other scholars, because as she says, no one could possibly carry out all the experiments himself in order to verify by evidence what he wants to say. So most of what we believe, frankly, Cameron, is believed on the basis of testimony, including scientists. So she's making a very good point there that harks back to your point about memory beliefs and other sorts of beliefs that we rationally hold, even though they're not based on evidence.
Yeah.
That's right. So who is more humble? The scientist who looks at the universe with an open mind and accepts whatever the universe has to teach us, or somebody who says everything in this book must be considered the literal truth, And never mind the fallibility of all the human beings involved in the writing of this book.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I didn't hear anything. Now I do.
Oh, sorry, I had my microphone muted.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. I gave a quick summary. He says, who is more humble, the scientist that looks at the universe with an open mind, or someone who looks at an ancient text and says, this has to be the literal truth? What are your thoughts?
This relates to the point that we were making before, namely, humility is a personal virtue, but it is not a test for truth. And in any case, this is a false dichotomy. Scientists can be very arrogant and religious people very humble. A scientist once remarked to me that science is an endeavor in which selfish ambition fortunately coincides with the advance of the discipline. Now, that's certainly not true of theology. The Bible says God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So, as theologians, we have every incentive to inculcate an attitude of humility in our work and our person.
Yeah, and it's almost like he's asking, who is more humble, the person who's not humble or the person who's humble? Obviously, the person who's humble is more humble, but anybody can be arrogant, as you say. It doesn't. You don't just have to be a person of faith to be arrogant. You can. Anybody can be humble. Anybody can be arrogant. So yeah, it's just not a super.
There are still those in science who say the exquisite nature of the universe, the exquisite laws of the universe, are evidence of a designer, of a creator. Mm-hmm. Does that view make sense to you?
It's very tempting. I mean, we want to be thought of as children being cared for by an omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent creator. I mean, think of all the uncertainties and turmoil and terrors of our life, which would be made less terrifying if this were true. But here, if anywhere, is a case where we must not believe because we want it to be true. Now, if you take a look at Darwin, you see a case where it was so tempting to say, I find a watch. It requires a watchmaker. Watches do not spontaneously self-assemble. And now I find an acorn, or a squid, or a bacterium. It is much more intricately and exquisitely put together than a watch. Here too there must have been a creator. It's very natural. But what Darwin pointed out is that there's a perfectly reasonable process, which is inevitable, which will create enormous, exquisite order out of chaos given enough time. If we thought the universe was only 6,000 years old, there is not enough time and evolution is nonsense. But if, as in fact is now definitively true, the solar system and the Earth are 4.5 billion years old, then there's plenty of time for evolution, and our sense that order means creator is wrong. Finally, you can say, look, you can go back as far as you want, but somehow the stuff of the universe had to come from somewhere, and isn't that what God did? But that's only true if the universe was created. If the universe was always here, if the universe was infinitely old, then there's nothing for a creator to do. Most of us would be surprised to hear that the universe is going to end one day. We expect the universe to go on forever into the future. Why do we have the idea that it doesn't go on forever into the past? I'm not saying I know the answer to this. This is one of the deepest questions. We do not know the answer. We simply have to keep an open mind. All of us, philosophers, scientists, religious people, no one, in fact, knows.
All right, so this clip was obviously a lot. So let's get a quick summary of this one as well. He says it's tempting to infer design. He says that we want to be thought of as taken care of by a loving, powerful God. Then he says the watchmaker argument is intuitive, but Darwin pointed out that complexity will inevitably arise out of chaos given enough time. Then he says the universe, if it's this old, there's plenty of enough time for evolution, which means that our order means creator inference is wrong. Then he says if the universe is infinitely old, there's nothing for a creator to do. I mean, all of these can be taken issue with, pretty much all of these. Then he says no one scientist or philosopher knows the true age of the universe. So, Dr. Craig, your thoughts?
Well, here I think, Cameron, the video has been overtaken by advances in contemporary science. Do you know when these video clips were made?
When this video was published a year ago, although I don't know when the original clips that he took them
I
from were
wonder
created.
if they might not have been filmed in the 1960s or early 70s, because they are so out of date now. The neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is now being sharply challenged by the so-called extended evolutionary synthesis. Additional explanatory mechanisms are required in order to explain the evolution of biological complexity in a relatively short time. Moreover, the evidence strongly supports the conclusion that the universe is not infinite in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. So in this video, I think we just see how much the scientific situation has changed in a way that is, as I say, is very conducive toward theism.
One of the things I'd like to get your thoughts on is he says at one point in this clip, he says if the universe is really this old, there's plenty enough time for evolution, which means that our order means creator inference is wrong. Now, it seems like he's just saying that inference is fallible, but that doesn't necessarily, to me, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be wrong, which it seems like that's sort of required for his argument. He wants to say that inference is just bad, just never use it, because we have this other example, evolution, where order means creator is wrong. But all that would do in my mind is point out that inference is fallible, but it can nevertheless still be used as an inference. Like if you were to find an arrowhead in a river, like you would obviously infer design, because that's an orderly, it's like the shape of it and stuff, like that's not just going to happen in nature by accident. And so just because you've got this one example that you can point to, namely evolution, that doesn't mean that you're always just going to be able to undermine every design inference. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're quite right. I would say that billions and billions of years would be a necessary condition for the blind evolution of life, but it wouldn't be a sufficient condition. It still might well be the case that a design inference is justified, even given the lengthy past history of this planet.
Another thing that he says is if the universe is infinitely old, then there's nothing for a creator to do. And I think I've actually heard some Christian apologists, I'm not going to name anyone, but I have heard some people say that, if the universe is eternally old, then you don't need God, or you don't need a creator. There's really not, and that's kind of what Sagan does here. But I think that's a mistake given the argument from contingency. Even if the universe is infinitely old, it's still contingent. It's still a contingent thing, and that there's got to be some explanation as to why that eternal thing exists as opposed to some other eternal thing. And
Absolutely. But that's because you're thinking like a philosopher, and someone like Sagan or Stephen Hawking, with his very famous question, what need then for a creator if you have a beginningless universe? They don't understand that even if you have a past eternal universe, you still face the question, why does an eternal universe exist rather than nothing? Or why does an eternal universe exist rather than one with a finite beginning, or a finite beginning of some shorter duration? It does nothing to undermine Leibniz's fundamental argument from contingency for the existence of a metaphysically necessary being who is the sufficient reason for why anything at all exists.
Right. And there's other examples that one could give of something that is eternal, but it is nevertheless grounded in something else. Josh Rasmussen gives an example of mathematical sets. Mathematical sets are grounded in their individual members, but those are also eternal. But so you can have this sort of grounding relation between two things, even though one of them or both of them are eternal. And so it could be the case that that's the sort of relation that exists between God and the universe, even if the universe is eternally old, as one of grounding. Any thoughts on that?
I think what you're saying there is that explanatory priority need not be chronological priority. And that seems quite right. In order to be explanatorily prior, something need not be chronologically prior.
Right. Yep. Okay, let's move on. Let's get the last clip in before we've got to close out the stream today. So this one is where did the universe come from? That's what, and this one is a relatively short clip. It's about a minute long. So we'll get this one, and then we'll say goodbye to Dr. Craig for today.
The general picture, however, of a Big Bang followed by an expanding universe is correct. What happened before that? Was the universe devoid of all matter, and then the matter suddenly somehow created? How did that happen? In many cultures, the customary answer is that a God created the universe out of nothing. But if we wish to pursue this question courageously, we must, of course, ask the next question. Where did God come from? If we decide that this is an unanswerable question, why not save a step and conclude that the origin of the universe is an unanswerable question? Or, if we say that God always existed, why not save a step and conclude that the universe always existed, that there's no need for a creation, it was always here? These are not easy questions. Cosmology brings us face to face with the deepest mysteries, with questions that were once treated only in religion and myth.
All right, there it is. That's the last clip. So basically, again, an argument. This is not the first time we've heard. Where did God come from? Who created God? If this is unanswerable, why not save a step and hold that the origin of the universe is unanswerable? And then he says if we say that God has always existed, why not just save a step and hold that the universe has always existed? What are your thoughts here?
Well, the question here is where did God come from? And I want to say emphatically, this is not an unanswerable question. Rather, the answer is that God never began to exist. He is an eternal being, and so he does not need a cause. Now, Sagan says, well, in that case, why not say that the universe has always existed? And the answer to that question, of course, will be the cosmological evidence in support of the Big Bang model, as well as the philosophical arguments concerning the impossibility of an infinite regress of events. So we have very good reasons to think that the universe cannot be past eternal, whereas God can, as a transcendent creator, be eternal and never began to exist.
One last thing that I'll add to that is that Josh Rasmussen has really sort of helped me see the importance of trying to locate something. How do we tell if something is uncaused? What sort of features are we looking for when we want to say that something exists without explanation, without a cause? And I think that's actually at the heart of a lot of these conversations between Christians and atheists, or not just Christians, but theists and atheists, is we're trying to locate, well, how do we find something that could be foundational, could be without cause? And so a lot of atheists will say, well, it's just the universe. You know, the universe is non-personal. It doesn't have a cause. But is that actually a good candidate for something that could be foundational, could be without cause? And what Josh Rasmussen points out is that those naturalistic alternatives are going to end up having all of these arbitrary limits in power, limits in value, all sorts of different limits that sort of cry out for explanation. Normally, when we come across a limit in nature, we want to ask questions like, well, why does that thing have that limit? And but when you're talking about something that's foundational, you can't do that. You can't go then look for a deeper explanation of that thing because we're talking about the thing that is foundational. So then we've got to compare theories. We've got to compare the theistic theory to the naturalistic theories or the atheistic theories. And I think the point I just wanted to make is that it's a really deep question. I think that that's actually where people should be focusing their attention is on these sorts of questions of what could be foundational, what sort of properties must that thing have. And I think I'm convinced by mainly the work of Josh Rasmussen that theists have the upper hand here. Theism, God's existence, provides a much better account of how something could be uncaused, unexplained, foundational. So any thoughts on that before we close out the show?
I agree with you that God, the classical concept of God, is a much more plausible candidate for the metaphysically necessary being that is the sufficient reason for the existence of everything else than the contingent, variegated universe itself.
That has all sorts of weird properties. We would want to ask deeper questions about why it has those certain arbitrary properties. Well, Dr. Craig, thank you so much again for joining me on Capturing Christianity. Is there anything you'd like to leave with the audience before we close out?
Well, just say thank you for inviting me to join you and talking about Carl Sagan. That was sort of a blast from the past, and I enjoyed seeing him again and hearing his voice, and glad to have interacted with you, and I hope it's been helpful to folks.
Do you mind if we take a quick super chat that was just sent in? This should be just a yes or no question from you once we get it asked here. All right, this one from Joe Malik says, "Thank you for your time, Dr. Craig. I'm curious to know if you have watched Richard Dawkins' recent interview with Alex O'Connor, where Dawkins made another comment on debating you and your beliefs."
I haven't seen it myself, but I have heard from many people about it. And I think that Kevin Harris and I may well be doing a podcast responding to this very interesting interview with Alex O'Connor and Richard Dawkins. So be on the lookout for that.
That's exciting. That's great. All right. Well, Dr. Craig, thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you later.
Okay. Bye, Cameron.